So we've been working together for a long time with Land Loss and Rural Coalition, and also the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Oklahoma Black Historical Research Project, Operation Spring Black, and about 50 groups. And, you know, oftentimes it's like watching, we implement one farm bill, then we, you know, go and find out what are the experiences of farmers, what are the next set of problems, because every time you solve one problem, you end up seeing that there are 3 more things that could be done. So one of the other things we did was developed equitable relief language, because if USDA makes a mistake, the farmer could still be liable to lose it. And this basically says that if USDA makes the mistake, then there has to be a time that the farmer has to work out a solution with USDA. Why don't we go to the next one? So that's how we started choosing the issues. And, you know, what we've known for a long time, you know, one of the founding members of the Rural Coalition is the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, and which merged with the Emergency Land Fund. And, you know, they've done studies over many, many years on, you know, on the problem with heirs property. And, you know, as you can see, it's an endemic problem. And then, you know, it's been explained by others, when Hurricane Katrina came along, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta started noticing exactly what somebody asked a question about, is that not all homes were being repaired. There was not either insurance or there weren't access to FEMA benefits. And so whole neighborhoods were not able to be repaired, which also brought down the property value for others and also led to oftentimes buyouts of property. So at that point, there was a lot of interest on the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property. And so that kind of also gave us the idea of how do we connect that in some way to the Farm Bill. So let's go to the next one, Robert. And so whenever you're developing new programs, you look at what precedents that you've got for solving that problem. And so we had worked with the tribal groups like Intertribal Agriculture Council in 2008 and 2014 to get new relending programs, fractionated land programs, because fractionated land was also one of the largest causes of loss of tribal lands. So people, you know, you would not have the deed to your property, and you know, somebody would have some kind of interest and end up losing a piece of land. But then also, because these issues were never resolved, there were some pieces of land where, like, there's 1 million owners and everybody owns a piece that's this big, which means you can't do anything with it. So in 2008, there was language to set up a relending program that went to tribes. And then in 2014, that was extended to allow individual tribal families to be able to use that. But we wanted to translate that, but it wasn't going to work exactly correctly because BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs at Department of Interior, holds all the land records for all owners of tribal land. And so it's a whole lot different thing than the families themselves holding the land. And so in some ways it was easy to do this, in some way it was easier to do it. And then also the tribes already have specific lending agreements with the Department of Agriculture. So they're able to lend, you know, the USDA can lend funds in that way, and there was already the authority. So we couldn't quite use that program, and we had to come up with some different ways to do it. So let's go to the next one. And one of the issues that we also knew is that with regard to some of the programs of the department, well, all of the farm programs of the department, is you had to have 100% of all the owners to agree if you were going to be able to get into a USDA program. So that, and in this case, the Uniform Partition Act looked at a majority. So getting 50.1% was a lot easier than getting 100%. And so that was like one of the things that kind of got particularly in our chairperson, John Zippert's mind. He's like, yep, yeah, let's use this. And, Quentin, we had lunch in one of the Senate office buildings with John Zippert and myself with our friend or our policy advisor, Quentin Robinson. And he said, that's crazy. You're never going to get anything like that. And so we were also looking at, well, what else could we do? And so Oklahoma Historical Research Project was working on installing solar water wells and dealing with mitigation programs for eastern red cedar. And we were doing some research. And what was happening is they were doing a lot of, the farmers would be applying to EQIP. And we were looking at the numbers. And let's go to the next slide. And, as we were doing that, we were finding basically what's showing here is you see that there's almost a reverse order in the EQIP program, that the places where most of the EQIP funds were going were not the places where the largest coalition, the largest representation of socially disadvantaged farmers, both mainly here tribal and African American farmers. And so, what we're also finding out is when we looked at county by county data on participation in these programs, that a lot of people were applying, but many people were being rejected as ineligible. And the reason that we discovered underneath the ineligibility, and this was Willard Tillman's work in Oklahoma, was that people didn't have title to their land, so therefore they didn't have a farm number. They couldn't demonstrate control of the land unless they had anybody who was an owner sign off on it, and they didn't have a lease, so therefore they couldn't get into EQIP. And the same was true of the other programs. And this is a research paper on eastern red cedar, and I'll share the link in the chat box when I finish. But basically what we found is, that this problem tracks through all of the programs. So let's go to the next slide, and then the one after that. The next one is Conservation and Stewardship Program. And again, you see, that where the benefits are going are not where the Black farmers and tribal farmers are. And then if you see, you'll see the same thing, and go to the next slide, in the Conservation Reserve Program. And if you don't have those resources in a place where eastern red cedar is taking over 700 or 800 acres a day, and you're trying to operate a cow and calf operation, it's going to be really hard for you to compete with the other farmers, and especially the larger farmers around. And you could drive around. We took the students from American University around, and you can just see, this is the white farm and this is the Black farm. These acres completely have red cedar mitigated and these don't. And be able to replant grazing and also make habitats for pollinators and so forth. So it's got an implication. And what also happens is there's an implication for wildfires and so forth, because eastern red cedar burns. And what used to happen before, in traditional times, there would be fire, and that was how it would be controlled. But you can't have fire as your mechanism to clear eastern red cedar when you have habitat, where people have homes and so forth. So, the level of wildfires was vastly increasing in Oklahoma. And so there's an ecological cost also. And then there are also hundreds and hundreds of acres of dormant land that were not contributing to the community. So I think that's kind of what we were finding in this research. And this kind of gave us some of the pieces that we need to provide evidence for new policy. So let's go to the next one. And here is an interesting piece just on racial disparities in will making. And I think it's probably been covered by my colleagues, but there just are not enough lawyers around, and particularly lawyers that will work with families in the communities where we need them, because oftentimes there's a majority community who you know, the lawyers might be conflicted out because they work for somebody who wants that piece of land. So, you know, it also helped to reinforce the idea that, you know, we're going to have to solve something about more looking at legal assistance. And let's go to the next one. So here's, you know, we worked on Farm Bill language. And so here's some of the things that we worked on were conservation and heirs property. You know, another one was securing permanent funding and authority for the outreach and assistance program for socially disadvantaged and veteran farmers and ranchers along with the Beginning Farmer and Rancher program, $25 million a year. By 2023, we'll have $25 million of permanent funding for each program, and the authority is permanent, so it won't expire if Congress doesn't get a funding bill done. And we've gotten a little bit more than that, even though there's some issues still in the management of the program. And then there were also changes in the guaranteed loan program where loan fees were waived for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, equitable relief. And then another important thing was legalizing the cultivation of industrial hemp and giving it to Ag Marketing Service to regulate. And so those are a couple things that we secured, and let's go into the depth on heirs property. So we identified this as a key barrier to participation. And we drafted a bill, and it had several elements I could go through, and it was the alternate documentation language that I'll explain that's the place that we consulted with Ben Orzeski. We also consulted with other people who were former USDA people in the credit section titles on writing what we need, and we went back and forth with USDA. And we got over 120 organizations that signed on to this, and we put in specific language that connected the federal legislation and the Farm Bill to uniform partition. So let's go into a little depth on what we did there. Okay, so, you know, we drafted this bill and we took it to Felix and Representative Marcia Fudge's office and said, you know, and he said, she's going to be really interested in this. And so she got it written, but she wasn't yet able to introduce it, but it was actually introduced later. And then Doug Jones had been, he won the Senate seat that he's more recently lost. And we also talked to Tim Scott, and then we worked with Senator Udall. And we talked to Senator Jones's staff person, and, you know, we said, here's this heirs property bill. And she said, well, who's going to introduce it? And we said, well, your office, we hope. And she goes, oh, can I give you a hug? And they were really excited about this bill. And so it was first introduced on the Senate side and started moving through the congressional process. Let's go next. So on the language was incorporated into 3 sections of the Senate bill at the last minute, and we went back and forth on the credit issue for all kinds of time, and we worked very closely with Senate Ag Committee, and we had, you know, 36 different meetings, and we probably had about 15 people that were participating in the drafting. And the bill went to the full bill went to the floor with these sections added on in the manager's amendment, and also included was the permanent funding and authority and all those other things. And the bill passed the Senate on June 28th by, I think, a margin of like 87 to 12 or 13 or something like that. It was a few hours after our colleague Ralph Page passed away. And, you know, he'd been there when we originally did Section 2501, and we kind of think that he didn't stop working after he ascended above. And, you know, to us, it was, you know, very interesting and wrenching time. And then we got Representative Fudge and Mr. Bishop on the Senate side, Sanford Bishop, and Representative Alma Adams worked really hard to get it accepted into, in conference. The House accepted the Senate language. And there was also, so there were 3 sections, and then there was a 4th section. And I think especially the Federation of Southern Cooperatives worked with the state mediation programs to also allow mediation to be an issue that was considered in state mediation programs, and also to get the funding for that program. And now we'll go into the heirs property particular language. So the manager's amendment, so when the Farm Bill passes, there's a whole package that goes into it. And so in the conference committee, they made sure they made really clear to say, this is what we mean by who farm owners are and why this bill is necessary. And then the next slide, sorry, Robert. And so the intention here is that operators on heirs property need to be made eligible to receive a farm number for the purposes of getting into farm programs. And, that in itself is a real step forward. And then let's go into the particular language. I think it's on the next slide. Oh, and then this is the definition of state. So you have to think of like all these little things. And one of the people who was very interested in supporting this was Representative Stacey Plaskett of the Virgin Islands. Because if you look at land tenure issues, both in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, and probably all the territories, there are also many, many issues with the recording of deeds and so forth. So, we used a model from tribal language, and then we're also trying to have something that's beneficial in the territories, but most especially it's helping Black farmers. And so we used that definition of state, and we also had support from Representative Plaskett also in committee, and we had a number of sign-on letters from Congress, members of Congress, and especially the Black Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus. Okay, and the next slide. So here is exactly what it says about eligible documentation. So if you're going to participate in a conservation program, you have to show you have control of your land. And this is the language. Number 1 is the one that Ben Orzeski wrote for us. We said, Ben, what is the thing that connects this to the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act? So that's where it says in states that have adopted the Uniform Partition Act, basically you have to go and get, as was probably explained in the last section, a court order verifying basically that this is heirs property, or you get a certification from the local recorder of deeds and that you've entered into a process to retitle the land. It's sort of like stop action. So you could actually take that court order to USDA and say, okay, here's the court order and I'm empowered to act on this. It's kind of like designating an executor. But and they're not going to get the land itself, but they're going to get a farm number so that somebody can access conservation benefits. But we know that not all states have uniform partition acts, and as we were talking with the Senate Ag Committee, they told us that look, white farmers used to be able to do this under Ag Conservation and Stabilization Service programs for a long time. They can just say, I have control of the land, and they would be able to somehow keep it, or there'd be some understanding of who actually, owned the land, particularly in those times when wills were being worked out. So also, if you simply do a tenancy in common agreement, I think the Federation's been doing a lot of those, and I know Land Loss has, that shows everybody agrees. If you can show tax returns with Schedule F really in it for the last 5 years, that you've actually been farming the land, you can make a self-certification that you have control of the land, or any other documents identified by the Secretary. Now, this is only to participate in programs. It's not to buy the land. It's not to be able to sell it. So let's go to the next piece. So what happened is they, on September 11, 2019, USDA put in the FSA handbook, and I can't see my notes right now, but there we'll give you the complete slides with the notes on them. But there's a specific section in the Farm Service Agency handbook. So when you're trying to work with farmers, this is the section you need to go to say, look, it's here. And the local committee and the county committees can also look at other acceptable documentation, but this is only for somebody who can demonstrate they're an heir to that property. And so that's what's required in the handbook, and that section will be important for people to refer to as you're training farmers. Let's go to the next one. And this one is, how do you determine who's the operator? And if you look at, let me see, I think some of these were edited a little bit. These are all the ways to do it. And then at the very end, there's a little subsection in which says, refer to the section before if you're an heirs property owner, and then you should, you refer to that last section for if you're an heirs property owner, and then they will be coded in the system as unknown ownership, but they can still get the farm number. So that's the next piece, and then let's go to the next slide after that. Yeah, and I'll pull that one out. I'm sorry, it's not up on the screen. The relending program, so that was number one, and it allows farmers to get into conservation programs, and probably NAP and most farmers that have some evidence of farming and that the crop belongs to them should be able to get crop insurance. Now, how do you actually solve the problem? And this relending program was the one that was inspired by the tribal language from the last two farm bills. And basically, it's the first time under Farm Service Agency credit programs that there has been a provision to lend to beyond an individual, with the exception of tribes. So it authorizes that funds can be lent to qualified intermediaries who have experience in dealing with, up like 10 years experience in dealing with socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And the funds, they have to show also that they're a qualified intermediary who knows how to make loans, but it can be a cooperative or a kind of a CDFI. And there's money authorized. And we kind of modeled the structure of the program also on the relending program in rural development. And so Congress has so far, so it's that first time we've kind of looked at lending to groups of people under this title. And so $5 million was allocated. This administration actually asked for another $5 million this year, which is also still pending on the Hill, but they still have not rolled out the program. And what that means is you can make a loan to a group of individuals, so to help them buy each other out. And there also needs to be, as a condition of this, that they do a will. And the legal costs can be part of the closing cost. So the cost of doing a family tree and some of those other things can be rolled into the loan. And yes, it is a loan. We used the loan program because we were looking at the model from the tribes, but also because that's where the money is. And so that's where that program was set up. And it's probably going to need even more money. But, it would help actually also make more use of the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. And then I'll try and wrap up pretty quickly because I think I'm probably going. Let's go to the next one. And then this slide is farm ownership data collection. This one has not yet been funded, but it would be for the National Ag Statistics Service to do a study, basically based on their total land survey, to look at land that's held both in undivided interest and also held in absentee ownership. And where you have farm operators, you have people buying up the Mississippi Delta right now. And it would have needed the $3 million over the 5 years of the Farm Bill. And so this is one we're hoping to lift up. And we're also hoping the research being done here can be very important in showing Congress that they really need to fund this and we need to expand it. And, you know, it's going to help us with research on this issue because there's really very little issue. We checked with an actuarial firm we know, and they connected us to CoreLogic, and CoreLogic says like for something like $500,000, we could, you know, buy the database of what's currently in heirs property. When you look at all the land that was lost already, you know, that's an unimaginable amount. Let's go to the next slide. And so basically it's like using the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act together with this new Farm Bill language. We can go to the next one. And so here's some other things that we need to do in the future. In order to participate in all the other Farm Service Agency programs, the commodity and other kinds of programs, which actually Black farmers participate in only a little, and we're still watching to see what happens in the CFAP program, which doesn't have other eligibility criteria, but FSA and forestry programs have other eligibility criteria. And so we're going to have to go back in the next Farm Bill or through the regulatory process and try and look at what they're saying denies alternate, you know, people using alternate documentation from getting into that program. We weren't able during the Farm Bill to get into the housing section because they didn't do the housing section in the, you know, rural housing. And we also started with FEMA. And before we get to that, let me just say that, you know, that we need the research and documentation, and we need much more availability of legal services, including lawyers in the community that know how to use the Uniform Partition Act because we think it's underutilized. We also need the U.S. Census and others to not only ask, are you an owner or a renter, because there should be another category. And then finally, let's go to the next slide and I'll get into the issue on housing and flood insurance, which is that, you know, that CoreLogic map that Connor showed you of how much land is, or how many housing elements, the percentages that are in undivided interest. This is a picture from the Washington Post of one block before and after, you know, what happened with Katrina. And that, you know, it's a huge issue. Well, one of the, let's go to the next slide. One of the leaders of, or one of the people that we worked with who's an insurance agent said that at the time of Katrina, only about 5% of all the properties in like the lower Ninth Ward were insured at all. And then we started talking about with Senator Jones and with Representative Fudge, what about FEMA, what about flood insurance? And FEMA looked at their, you know, documentation requirements, and if you can show you lived in the property, but then, you know, you can be a renter, but you're not really an owner. And then we started looking, if you bought flood insurance, would you be able to, you know, if you're an heirs property owner and you don't have a title to the land, can you buy insurance and can you do a claim? And the National Flood Insurance Program could not answer that question. And the insurance agents we talk with, you know, said, no, this is a very, very big problem. And it's also a problem, and that the flood insurance bill is basically set up to protect the mortgage industry and to protect public housing. But it really, there's a great underinsurance rate, both for flood insurance, but also property and casualty insurance. And then the insurance agent also told us if you buy property, casualty, and liability insurance together, that he wouldn't want to insure an LLC structure because then they would be responsible for liability that anybody of those multiple owners incurred. So this is a whole area, and also just eligibility within USDA and other federal agencies for getting FEMA direct assistance or to be able to repair housing without a title.